Okay, good afternoon, Year 11. Miss Chamberlain here. This is the English Language Paper 2 revision session today. Just a quick reminder that this session is being recorded and it will be possible to re-watch this session on the Washwood Heath Academy English Department YouTube channel, links to which can be found at the bottom of this screen, but also will be placed on to show my homework along with the text that we've looked at today. Just another reminder that there was a paper 1 session earlier today that can also be accessed via YouTube. And finally, there is a session tomorrow at 12, which is looking at how you can achieve grade 7 or above in section B on both paper 1 and paper 2. That session is open to absolutely everyone, and you don't have to be someone who has a target of a 7 to be able to have a look at that. I'm going to look at some quick wins and hints and tips on how you might be able to get a grade 7 on that question tomorrow. But today, for the next hour, maybe just under an hour, we're going to have a very quick look through at paper 2 of English language. So let's get started. So just a quick reminder, ladies and gentlemen, that language paper 2, which is the writer's viewpoint and perspective paper, is taking place on Friday, the 10th of June, again in the morning. There are 2 sections in this exam, section A, which is worth 40 marks, and section B, also worth 40 marks. The paper itself is an hour and 45 minutes in length, and it is suggested that you spend 1 hour on section A, which includes 15 minutes reading time, and that you spend 45 minutes on section B, which is sort of your only allocation of time for that. Reminder as well that section A assesses your reading ability, and section B assesses your writing ability. You must make sure that your writing is legible to ensure that your examiner can read and mark your work. Reminder that these examiners do not know you. They have several hundred papers to mark, and so you must make sure that your work is legible to enable you to pick up as many marks as possible. Today we are going to have a look at question 2, question 4 and question 5. Those are the questions that students find most challenging usually, and so those are going to be the focus of this. The text that we're using today will be available on Show My Homework, along with a link to this video and along with this PowerPoint, so that you can have a go at any of the questions that are referred to here. A reminder as well that I would suggest that you approach this exam in the order of the questions that you are given. The reason for that is that section B is going to ask you to write an article, and there will be an article in the text for you to read, so you'll have something to remind you of the structure of an article with you in the exam. But also you may find there are ideas being expressed that you may be able to draw some inspiration from. My suggestion is that you get into the exam, that you read both texts all the way through before you answer any of these questions. So you read all of text 1, all of text B, and then you do the questions in order. Okay, there are 15 minutes allocated for reading time, and then you should spend the remaining time on the questions. So the 45 minutes, my suggestion is that you spend 5 minutes on question 1, question 1, no longer than that, 10 minutes on question 2, 10 minutes on question 3, and then 20 minutes on question 4. That then leaves you the 45 minutes for the transactional writing. And although we're going to look at transactional writing today, just a reminder again that if you want to look at how you might be able to achieve a grade 7 or above for transactional writing, then do join me at 12 o'clock tomorrow. So those of you who've just joined us, just a reminder that this session is being recorded. So we're going to start today by looking at the two texts that would be given to you in this exam. So text 1 is they're both extracts of speeches written by female African writers, and they're both about the importance of a single story. In your exam, one of these texts will be a much older text and one a more modern text. Although one of these texts is older than the other, they're both within a similar time period. So there is a gap of time, but the gap may not be as pronounced as the one that would be in the exam that you will do. So I'm just going to start by reading these two texts through to you. However, whilst I'm doing that, I just want you to keep in mind question 2. So remember, question 2 asks you to refer to all of source A and all of source B. That doesn't mean you need to write about something from every single section. It just means that you're able to draw ideas from anywhere in the text. Both sources discuss why storytelling is important. Use details from both sources to write a summary of what you understand about the similarities that the speakers share on the importance of storytelling. So what you're looking at as I read through these texts to you today is, what do these writers say about why telling stories is important? So this is text 1. If a story moves you, act on it. In this speech, the writer Sisonke Mismang presents her thoughts and opinions about storytelling. Earlier this year, I was informed that I would be doing a TED Talk. So I was excited, then I panicked, then I was thrilled, then I was terrified. In between all of this, I started to do my research, and I was Googling Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. How many of you know who that is? I was Googling her because she always has important and interesting things to say. And the searches kept leading me to her talk on the dangers of a single story, on what happens when we have a solitary lens through which to understand certain groups of people. And it is the perfect talk. It's the talk that I would have given had I been famous first. You know, like, she's African and I'm African, and she's a storyteller and I'm a storyteller. So I really felt like it's my talk. But I decided that I should probably write my own TED Talk. And I'm here to talk about my own, excuse me, my screen has just gone funny, my own observations about storytelling. Since Adichie gave their talk, there has been a boom in storytelling. Stories are everywhere, and if there was a danger in the telling of one tired old tale, then I think there's got to be lots to celebrate about the flourishing of so many stories and so many voices. You can download stories at the touch of a button or the swipers of a screen. You can listen to a podcast about what it's like to grow up in Kolkata. You can hear an Indigenous man in Australia talk about the trials and triumphs of raising children in dignity and in pride. Stories make us fall in love. They heal rifts and bridge divides. But stories don't necessarily make the world a better place. Stories can create an illusion of solidarity. There is nothing like the feel-good factor you get from listening to a fantastic story where you feel like you climbed that mountain right, or that you befriended that death row inmate. But you didn't. You haven't done anything. Listening is an important but insufficient step towards social action. I think we're often drawn towards characters and protagonists who are likeable and human. And this makes sense, of course, right? Because if you like someone, then you care about them. But the opposite is also true. If you don't like someone, then you don't care about them. And if you don't care about them, you don't have to see yourself as having a moral obligation to think about the circumstances that shape their lives. I learned this lesson when I was 14 years old. I learned that actually you don't have to like someone to recognise their wisdom. And you certainly don't have to like someone to take a stand by their side. So my bike was stolen while I was riding it, which is possible if you're riding slowly enough, which I was. One minute I'm cutting across this field in the Nairobi neighbourhood where I grew up, and it's like a very bumpy path. And so I'm slowly pedalling, and all of a sudden I'm on the floor. I look up and there's this kid pedalling away, and he's about 11 or 12 years old, and I'm on the floor and I'm crying because I saved a lot of money for that bike. Instinct steps in and I start screaming, Mwezi, Mwezi, which means thief in Swahili. And all of these people come out and they start to give chase. This is Africa, so mob justice is in action, right? And I round the corner and they've caught him. The suspect has been apprehended, and they make him give me my bike back. And they also make him apologise. And when we stand there facing each other and he says sorry, but he looks at me with this unbridled fury. He is very, very angry. And it's the first time that I've been confronted with someone who doesn't like me simply because of what I represent. He looks at me with this look as if to say, you with your shiny skin and your bike, you're angry at me. So it was a hard lesson that he didn't like me. But you know what? He was right. I was a middle-class kid living in a poor country. I had a bike and he barely had food. There are a million angry boy on bike stories, and we can't afford to ignore them simply because we don't like their protagonists. So, a few concluding thoughts on what audiences can do. The world would be a better place, I think, if audiences were curious and asked more questions about the social context that created these stories that they love so much. And I think audiences should demand more buttons on their favourite websites. Buttons, for example, that say, if you like the story, click here to support a cause your storyteller believes in. And then lastly, I think that audiences can make the world a better place by switching off their phones, by stepping away from their screens. Excuse me. By stepping away from their screens and stepping out into the real world. Thank you. So that's our first text that we've looked at. Now, if we're keeping question 2 in mind, remember, we're looking at what this writer has told us about the importance of telling a story. Okay, and we want to be looking at the similarities between this writer and between the other writer who's going to also be talking about the importance of storytelling. So keep that in mind, and then in a moment, after we've read the second text, we're going to do some planning, or I'm going to do some planning and modelling of some writing to do with this question. So this is text 2, The Danger of a Single Story. In this speech, the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie speaks about the power of storytelling. I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of a single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably closer to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All of my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now this, despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I'd never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lai, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realised that people like me, girls with the skin the colour of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could exist in literature. So I started to write about the things I recognised. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But this unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So, what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I came from a conventional middle class Nigerian family. My father was a professor, my mother was an administrator, and so we had, as was the norm, live in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for his family. Then one Saturday we went to his village to visit, and his mother showed us beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. And I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I'd learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position towards me as an African was a kind of patronising, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection to human equals. So after I'd spent some time in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. But I must quickly add that I too am as guilty of the question of a single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates. There were debates going on about immigration, and, as often happens in America, immigration becomes synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. So I just made my screen go funny. There we go. Sorry. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realised that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I'd bought into a single story Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story, show people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and it is what they become. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to depossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanise. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north. She introduced them to a book about southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realise that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. So the first thing that you might notice from reading these two texts is that they are much longer than the one text that you have to read in paper one. And that's why I think it's really important that you read both of these texts through thoroughly before you do any of the questions, because there's a lot more text that you have to be able to wade through to find the answers. So question 2 is a question that asks you to identify similarities. It is not a question that asks you to talk about language or structure. It only asks you to summarise what you've learned about the similarities or differences between the two texts. The only other thing you have to do is you must make inferences. So you have to be able to say what that summary makes you understand. Okay, so what you infer from the information that you're given. So keep this really simple. There are 3 things you need to do. You need to make a statement, you need to use a quotation, you need to make an inference. That's how you summarise. And you need to do that with 2 comparisons to get yourself marks for question 2. So what you need to do, again, I would suggest that you spend a few minutes planning this question before you write it. And you may find that some of this planning will support you when it comes to when it comes to question 4 as well. So I'm going to come back to that planning in just a moment. You need to think about how you move between the texts here. So both the writers of source A and source B believe. This suggests, from this we can infer, likewise and also. Those are words that I would be expecting to see when you're writing about the similarities between a text. If you're writing about differences, then I'd obviously expect you to be using things like on the other hand, in contrast, opposingly, etc. So let's go back to question 2. Let's look very carefully at how we might have a go at this. I'm just going to switch over to my visualizer, so just bear with me one moment. It seems to have disappeared. Hold on. Here we go. Okay, so, like I said, I would suggest that you spend a couple of minutes before you write this answer just doing a very quick plan. Now that quick plan doesn't have to be massively detailed. You just need to literally write down A and B, and then you need a couple of points here and a couple of points here. And for each of these points, if you can jot down a quotation as well, it's just going to save you a bit of time. So if we consider text A, she's talking about storytelling being a really important idea, and that storytelling can make us feel empathy. So storytelling creates empathy, and we might remember a quotation for that. If you like someone, you care about them. Okay, now I'm only going to do one idea for each table, but you need to make sure that in the exam you do 2 ideas. And I'm only doing 1 idea because I want to have time to do some modelling. We also know that the writer of our second text has a very similar idea about stories and how they really matter. And she says, stories matter. Okay, so we know that she thinks stories are important in terms of educating us towards these texts. So what we need to do is we need to be able to turn these ideas into a statement, quotation, inference, comparison, statement, quotation, inference, paragraph. Okay, and we want to do this twice in total, once for the first set of ideas and again for the second set of ideas. But just in the interest of keeping it swift today, so we've got time to look at other texts, we're just going to do one of these paragraphs. Okay, so I'm going to think about that table, and I'm going to start by saying both the writers of source A and source B explore the importance of storytelling. So that's my introductory idea that links my ideas together. By using this word both, it means that I'm doing a bit of comparison. It means that I'm going to remember to talk about source A and source B. And then here, the importance of storytelling. Well, that reminds me of the exam question that I'm trying to answer here. So I'm then going to say, in source A, the writer explains that storytelling creates a sense of empathy. And then we'll use that quote. If you like someone, care about them. So you'll notice that I've got my statement here. Both the writers of source A and source B explore the importance of storytelling. In source A, the writer explains that storytelling creates a sense of empathy. That's my statement. I've then supported my statement with my quotation. If you like someone, you care about them. But now I've got to do the inference. I've got to explain what I learn from this statement. Now, I'm probably going to end up sounding like I'm repeating myself because I'm going to have to draw on this idea of empathy. But that's fine, okay? Because what I want to make sure is that I'm explicit in explaining what this makes me think. So I'm going to say, this suggests that the writer of source A believes that a carefully crafted story can make you empathize with a character and could even educate you about their culture. Because that's essentially what she's telling us. So you can see here, by using that phrase, this suggests, I'm making an inference, and then I'm exploring here really carefully what I'm getting from that. Now, this inference is your personal interpretation, so you can't really be wrong. But the next thing we need to do is, just like we've started here with this both, we then need to have another comparison here. So we might say, likewise, the writer of source B thinks storytelling can educate you. Then we're going to use that quotation, stories matter. This suggests that, like the writer of source A, the writer of source B recognises the educational importance of telling a story, of telling someone's story. So again, I'm just going to move that up. So again, we've got our statement. The writer of source B thinks storytelling can educate you. We've then got our quotation, nice and short, and we've then got our inference. This suggests that, like the writer of source A, the writer of source B recognises the educational importance of telling someone's story. That is 1 point, that's one paragraph that we've written. We've taken 1 point from text A and we've compared it to 1 point from text B. You need to do 2 of these, so this times 2 for this question. And it shouldn't take you any longer than 10 minutes. It's an 8-mark question. You don't want to spend loads of time on it. You don't want to be, eating into your other questions. But 2 paragraphs like that should help you score right up there in the full mark bracket. So keep that in mind for this question. Okay, just going to switch over my camera again so that I've got the PowerPoint back on the screen. So apologies again. So question 4 on this paper is another question that is asking you to make some comparison. So this one, it says, for this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. That doesn't mean you have to write about something from every single section of the text. It just means that there's no limit about where you can take an idea from. And this time it asks you to compare how the writers convey different attitudes to storytelling. And this is important to look at this question because of the how section. It means that you must analyse the method that's being used. And by method, they mean language, they mean structure, they mean any single device. So you will have noticed, for example, that both of those text are speeches, and in source A, the writer often seems to talk to the listeners, whereas in source B, she sounds very separate. That would be a relevant how, okay? So how does the writer of source A get their idea across? They appeal directly to the reader, okay? It says compare the methods the writers use to convey their attitudes. So that's really important because it's reminding you in those bullet points that you need to talk about the language and the structure, and you need to support reference to the text. So this question means that you need to express a clear and analytical point of view about how those writers use different methods to get their ideas across. It means that you need to justify your point of view through a really detailed discussion of the methods used by the writer. Now, one way to look at this question would be to consider it again in how you plan it. But this time it would be to look for the methods that you want to use in terms of comparison rather than the point that's being made. So I'm going to try and explain that a little bit clearer. It says, compare how the writers convey They're different attitudes to storytelling. So both of them have these views about storytelling. In source A, she directly addresses the reader. In source B, she's slightly more formal. That's the method that you're going to compare. In source A, she uses a specific personal example of her life to get across something. That's a method. In source B, she uses multiple examples, okay? In source A, she uses first-person pronouns. In source B, she also uses first-person pronouns. So that's what I mean by this idea of method, okay? What is it they're specifically doing? Do either of them use similes or metaphors, for example? Those are the things that we're looking at for methods. We're looking at specific things that we could write about in terms of methods. So again, I'm going to suggest that you would have a plan for this, where you would jot down the methods. And I'm just going to look very quickly at this with you again. So again, I apologise, I'm just switching over my screens. So let's look again at source A, okay? So I said that one thing that we could talk about is that this person uses direct address. Now, we could say that's also a rhetorical question, but our first method here might be direct address. So that would be a method that I'd be able to explain in my writing. If we look here, she says, I'm a storyteller and I would like to tell a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of a single story. I grew up on a university campus. I did this, I did that, okay? But this one is not at all using personal address. So we could just highlight this. And again, for our number one, we could put no personal or direct address. Another thing that we could obviously both highlight is the use of personal pronouns. Okay, so both writers are using personal pronouns. So let's take this as our planning tool again. So we've got A and we've got B, and then we're going to think in terms of methods. Now, I would suggest that you need 2 to 3 methods for each. I'm just going to look at one here. So I'm going to look at direct address and no direct address. And then obviously might talk about the personal pronouns for each as well. Okay, but what you need to do, and you'll notice that in some ways this is quite similar to question 2, but you must talk about the language that's being used, okay? And that is really, really important, okay? That is absolutely what you must be focusing on, the way that the writer is using methods. So you might start by saying, in source A, the writer, and actually, you know, it would be much better if we put down the writer's surname rather than the writer. So let's put in source A, employs direct address to convey to her audience how important she believes storytelling is. And then I'm going to use that. How many of you know? Now, I've made my what, I've got my how. I need to explain why this use of direct address is going to engage me as a member of the audience. So I might say the inclusive pronoun you makes the audience feel included in the discussion, which suggests that the writer values our contributions, which in turn highlights her belief that storytelling is something for all of us. In Saucy, Missing Wong employs direct address to convey to her audience how important she believes storytelling is. How many of you? This inclusive pronoun you makes the audience feel included in the discussion, which suggests that the writer values our contributions, which in turn highlights her belief that storytelling is something for all of us. However, in source B, Adichie does not use direct address. So instead, we might go for I'm a storyteller. No, let's explain that a bit better first. So, however, Adichie does not use direct address. Instead, she adopts a expert role to educate the reader. I'm a storyteller. And then we need to zoom in on the method that's being used. So we might say the use of the declarative statement. So the use of the declarative allows the reader to place trust in Adichie which means we are more likely to learn the message she wishes to convey. So hopefully you can see here that in this comparison, what we're being led by is the method that's being used by each writer. And by focusing on that method, the comparisons that we're making are talking about how trust is built up. So in Saucy, the writer employs direct address to convey to her audience how important she believes storytelling is. That's our what. How many of you? That's our how. The inclusive pronoun use, that's the zooming in of the why, makes the audience feel included in the discussion, which suggests the writer values our contributions, which in turn highlights the belief that storytelling is something for all of us. So here, I've said that it's important, and now I'm explaining why. However, so we've got that comparison. In source B, the writer does not use direct address. So that's a method. Instead, she adopts an expert role to educate the reader. I'm a storyteller. So that's my what, that's my how. The use of the declarative allows the reader to place trust in Adichie, which means we're more likely to learn the message she wishes to convey. Okay, so each of these are still discussing the viewpoint that each writer has. She thinks storytelling is important. She's got a clear message, okay? But each one is guided by the method. So when it comes to this question, if this is a question that you've struggled on previously because you've got over involved in making the comparisons and not talking about the language, consider being led by the method. Use the method as your point of comparison rather than the viewpoint that's being presented to you. Okay. I'm going to move on to look at question 5 for the last sort of 10 minutes of this session. And just switching back to my PowerPoint. So, as you know, question 5 is always going to be a piece of transactional writing. Because of COVID, we know for a fact that the transactional writing that you will be doing in the exam is an article. It could be a magazine article, it could be an online article, it could be a newspaper article. Regardless of what the article is, it will be an article. And regardless of what the article is, it will need similar structural features. So what I'm going to look at today with you is an example of a layout and a very quick planning tool. I'm going to do more in-depth work in tomorrow's session on aiming for a 7 on this question. I'm going to spend 30 minutes on creative writing tomorrow and 30 minutes on transactional writing. So again, please do join that session tomorrow. So the question is, the curriculum we're taught at school is full of literature and theories written by dead white men, and it does not reflect the diverse and multicultural world that we live in. Things need to change. Write an article for a magazine in which you explain your point of view on this statement. Now, this is a question that you can see is linked in some way to the 2 texts that you've looked at today. And this is why I say to you that it's always a good idea to read the extracts first before you do any of the writing. Now, you may be thinking, oh, but in November they weren't linked. One was about sweets and one was about fast fashion. Correct. But in the extract about sweets, there were still references to this idea of child labour. So you still had areas of ideas that you could pick up. Okay, but back to today. So remember that there's a very clear layout that you need to use when doing your transactional writing. You need to have a headline, a strap line, which basically adds more information to your headline, an introduction, which is either a descriptive hook or an anecdote, something to pull us in and want to engage. You then have idea 1, which is potentially where you outline your position. Idea 2, where you continue it. Idea 3, where you make it relevant to your reader. Idea 4, idea 5, and then your conclusion, the thing that you want them to do now, the call to action. It is so important that when you do this question, you spend some time planning. And I know that in lessons and in previous videos and previous revision sessions, we've talked about the 5-sentence plan. And the 5-sentence plan, I think, is a really effective way of planning, okay? And it simply means that you read the question and you write 5 sentences answering that question. And then each of those sentences becomes the topic sentence for a paragraph that follows. However, some students have said they'd like to look at other ways of planning. And so we're going to look today at how you might use a thesis planning tool to help you with that. So an alternative, another string to your bow, if you will. If you look at the screen right now, you can see that you've got an example of an article written about the topic that we've got. So this says, why we must teach more Black British writers in school. That's our headline. Ensuring teachers have knowledge of a wider range of Black writers is key to pushing diversity, says poet Denga Stone. That's our strapline. That strapline goes on to explain the headline. The past year has given us all pause for thought, has changed the way we live our lives and caused us to think about what we want the world around us to look like. The coronavirus, the Black Lives Matters movement and the shocking murder of George Floyd have had such incredible impact and highlighted the change we need to see across the world. We're starting to have honest and constructive conversations about what we teach our children, but we need these to be a larger scale and backed up by actual change. So that operates as an anecdote because they're making references to things that we can relate to. The need for change was clear to me even before a study commissioned by Teach First last year found that pupils could leave compulsory education without studying a single piece of literature written by a Black author. So that's a really clear topic sentence. I could just read the topic sentence and understand what's going to happen, but you'll notice that that topic sentence is then supported by really thorough supporting ideas. My experience from doing my own GCSEs, albeit it was some time ago, is that the focus on Black writers was on African American writers rather than British people's lived experiences. That's a supporting statement. That's almost evidence. We have so many incredible stories and storytellers from this country that there should never be a shortage of Black writers to study, but we need ways to get their voices heard. So that's the kind of the ending part of that paragraph. So you'll notice that the paragraphs here have these three sections: the topic sentence, the supporting or evidence statement, and then like the rounding up or the closing statement. We've then got the conclusion. No one is expecting schools to cover every lived experience, but in supporting teachers to see what's missing in the curriculum, they can help them to guide their students to understand so much more about the world around them. When you look back in the past year, that feels more important now than ever. And so that's the concluding statement. So if we're looking at how we can plan this in a way that perhaps isn't the 5-sentence plan, you might consider what we call this thesis planning tool. And the thesis planning tool asks you to break your idea down into these key areas: what the issue is, 3 reasons why it's an issue, 1 reason why people might disagree with you, and then your conclusion. And so you can use this thesis planning tool, and some of you may have looked at this in class, but you can use this thesis planning tool to help you highlight your ideas in a slightly different way. So when it comes to the statement that you're offered, you obviously do need to decide if you agree or disagree in some way, but that is what becomes your thesis. So your thesis, which is essentially the intro/anecdote of your letter, is that there needs to be more diversity in the school curriculum. So that would be my thesis statement, which I would then use to create my introduction. I then need to have 3 because reasons. Okay, so 1, 2, 3 reasons why I believe there needs to be more diversity. So I'm going to say that there are too many dead white men, that we live in a multicultural society, live in a MC world, global citizens. And I must also say, I might also say that school needs to reflect the students taught. If we think about those 2 texts that we've read today by those 2 writers, each of them wrote about how it's really important that we understand different societies and different cultures so that we don't end up believing a single story. So those would be my 3 because reasons. We then need a but reason. And there just needs to be 1. And that might be simple as, something like we don't need, not all, the but might simply be Shakespeare. I'm a big fan of Shakespeare, so I would hate to see Shakespeare taken off the curriculum. So I think that, you know, Shakespeare needs to be taught, but he needs to be taught alongside a much wider range. And then so is my conclusion, okay? My do now element. And that's do now as in the call to action. So it must be, you know, change needs to happen. Okay, so I very quickly, and you'll see that it's very similar in some ways to the 5-sentence plan, but instead of these being sentences, they're more about really big ideas. And then I need to take that information and I need to be turning that into my article. So, for example, my headline might be, we must include diversity in English. That might be my headline. And then my strap line might be something like, with more than 90% of texts written by dead white men, now is the time to change. So you can see here that this is essentially my thesis statement that's guiding me to write my headline, my strap line, and it would also guide me to go on and to do the introduction and the bits that follow it. Okay, so then, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of this section on, the session on paper 2. Like I've said before, if you're interested in seeing more of how to write a response for transactional writing and creative writing, please do join the 1-hour session tomorrow on getting a grade 7 and above on paper 1 and paper 2 in terms of writing. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope that's been of use, and I look forward to seeing some of you in tomorrow's session. Have a good week, Year 11. Thank you. Goodbye.